Go be with your daughter. That was all Ethan said. He didn't ask for money, didn't ask for thanks, just handed the keys back to a massive biker in a Hells Angels vest and watched him roar off into the storm. It was the most natural thing in the world to Ethan Walker. It was also the decision that would destroy his life and then rebuild it into something he never could have imagined. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The storm hit Cedar Ridge without warning. One minute the sky was the bruised purple of late October twilight, and the next it opened up like a wound. Sheets of cold rain hammering the pavement, lightning cracking somewhere over the mountains, the kind of weather that made even locals pull their cars over and wait it out. Summit Auto Works sat dark and locked at the edge of the industrial district, its bay doors rolled down, its parking lot empty, except for a single rusted pickup that belonged to the night janitor, Old Pete, who'd be done mopping and gone within the hour. Ethan Walker was supposed to be gone already. He was 32 years old and he had the kind of face that people trusted on instinct, not because he was particularly handsome, but because there was nothing hidden in it. What you saw was what you got. Blonde hair that curled slightly at the temples when it got wet, which it was right now, because he'd stepped outside twice already to check whether he'd left a torque wrench in the bed of his truck. He hadn't. He was just stalling. That was the truth he didn't like to admit. He was stalling because going home meant going to an apartment that still smelled like his ex-girlfriend's shampoo. A woman who had left 8 months ago with the simple and devastating explanation that she couldn't love someone who cared more about other people's problems than his own future. He hadn't argued with her. He'd helped her carry boxes to her car. So he stayed late at Summit Auto Works the way he usually did, finding small tasks to keep his hands busy. He tightened a loose bolt on the hydraulic lift. He organized a shelf of brake fluid that didn't really need organizing. He drank the last cold inch of coffee from a mug that said, "World's Okayest Mechanic," and stared out the small window beside the break room sink. That was when he heard it, not clearly at first. The rain was loud and the ventilation unit on the roof had a rattle that management kept promising to fix. But underneath all of that, there was a sound that Ethan recognized the way a doctor recognizes a particular kind of cough with professional instinct in a low-level alarm. An engine misfiring, not just sputtering because of rain on an old plug, something deeper, something wrong in the way that suggested the motorcycle wasn't going to make it much farther. He set down the mug. The sound got closer. Then it stopped entirely. And then after a moment that felt longer than it was, there was a knock on the side door of the garage. Not the front entrance, the side door, the one mechanics used to come in and out during shifts, the one that Ethan happened to be standing 12 feet away from. He looked at it for a second. The rule was clear, and Richard Cole had stated it plainly at the last staff meeting: no customers after closing time. Not for any reason. The liability alone, Richard said, was enough to bankrupt a shop like Summit if something went wrong. Besides which, if you make exceptions for one person, you end up making exceptions for everyone, and before you know it, you're running a charity instead of a business. Ethan knew the rule. He opened the door anyway. The man standing outside was enormous. That was the first thing, the sheer physical scale of him, well over 6 feet, shoulders wide enough to fill the door frame forearms like structural components. He was soaking wet water dripping from the brim of a black bandana wrapped around his head, running down the lines of a face that was all angles and weathered skin and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He was wearing a leather vest over a soaked black t-shirt, and on the back of that vest, Ethan could see it clearly in the light spilling out from behind him. Hells Angels, Colorado. The man's Harley-Davidson sat behind him in the parking lot, rain-slicked and still not making a sound, because it clearly couldn't. Any reasonable person would have taken 3 steps back and said the shop was closed. Ethan looked at the motorcycle first, the way it was leaning slightly, the wet trail on the pavement, suggesting the rear brake had been dragging, probably a seized caliper, possibly worse. And then he looked at the man's face. That was when he noticed it. Not aggression, not the territorial posture that people assign to men who look like this. What Ethan saw in Jackson Ryder's face was fear. The raw, barely controlled fear of someone who had somewhere critical to be and no way to get there, and who was running out of time in a way that had nothing to do with motorcycles or weather or any of the practical problems that Ethan could see and name and fix. It was the fear of a parent. Ethan had seen it before on his own father's face in the hospital waiting room when Ethan was 9 years old and his younger sister had fallen from a tree and broken her arm badly enough to require surgery. His father, a man who could fix a tractor engine blindfolded and never cried at funerals, had sat in that waiting room with his hands clasped between his knees and his face stripped of every pretense, every adult defense, every layer of competence and control. He'd just been afraid. Just been a father who couldn't do anything but wait. That was what Ethan saw now. "We're closed," Ethan said, and then before the man could turn away, "But tell me what's happening." The man blinked, like he hadn't expected that. "My daughter," he said. His voice was deep, roughened by years and weather, but it broke slightly on that second word. Just slightly. "She's 7. She's in emergency at St. Catherine's in Denver. I got the call an hour ago. Her fever spiked. They think it might be—" He stopped, started again. "I was 40 miles out when the bike started going. Made it this far and that's it. She's alone up there. Her mother is in Albuquerque. My brother is in a meeting I can't reach him at. And he looked at the motorcycle. I need to get to Denver." Ethan was already looking at the Harley. "What year is it?" 2014. Softail. Ethan stepped past him into the rain without a jacket, crouching beside the motorcycle with the flashlight from his belt. He ran his thumb along the rear caliper, felt the heat still radiating off it despite the rain. Checked the brake line, stood up and looked at the man. "You were riding with a seized rear caliper. Lucky the tire didn't blow." "Can you fix it?" "I can fix it. Give me 45 minutes. The man, he hadn't given his name yet, stared at him. "It's past 10. Your place is closed." "I know. You're going to get in trouble." "Probably." Ethan was already walking back toward the garage. "You want to stand here talking about it, or you want to get to your daughter?" The man didn't answer with words. He just followed. Inside, under the fluorescent lights, the motorcycle looked worse than it had in the rain. The rear caliper wasn't just seized, the brake fluid had overheated and partially cooked in the lines, which explained the dragging and the progressive loss of rear braking the man described. The slide pins were corroded badly. It needed a full caliper replacement, not just a bleed and flush. And Ethan spent the first 10 minutes of those 45 doing a careful inventory of what he had in the shop's parts room versus what would require a call to an emergency supplier. He had what he needed. Not perfectly matched parts, a Summit Auto Parts replacement kit that would fit the application with some modification, which he'd done 100 times before with vintage American bikes. It wouldn't be a show-quality rebuild, but it would get the man to Denver and back safely. While Ethan worked, the man sat on a stool nearby, not hovering, not offering to help in a way that would interfere. He just watched. His phone was in his hand, and he was composing a text to someone, probably the hospital, his thumbs moving carefully for hands that large. After about 15 minutes, the man said, "My name is Jackson." Ethan looked up from the caliper assembly. "Ethan, you do this often? Let strangers in after hours?" "No." "Why tonight then?" Ethan thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. "Because you needed it," he said, "and I was here, and I could." He looked back down at the work. Seemed like enough reasons. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Then you saw the vest. Hard to miss. Most people see the vest and decide the rest before I open my mouth." "People do that," Ethan agreed. "I try not to." "Why?" Ethan set down the brake line tool and looked at him again. "Because I've been on the other side of it. I drive a 10-year-old truck and with rust on the quarter panels, and I show up to customer consults, sometimes still in my work clothes. People make decisions about who I am before I get through the door. Doesn't feel right to do it to someone else." Jackson looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face that shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that Ethan could have described precisely, but something. "How old is your daughter?" Ethan asked. 7, Lily. The name came out differently than the rest of his words. Softer, like it was made of something different. "She likes horses, draws them constantly. Every piece of paper in my house has a horse on it." He almost smiled. "Her mother says she'll be a veterinarian. I say she'll be an artist. We've been arguing about it for 3 years. What does Lily say she'll be?" Jackson's expression changed entirely. "She says she'll be both. Has a whole plan worked out. Treats the animals in the morning, paints them in the afternoon." He shook his head slowly. 7 years old, and she's already more organized than I've ever been. Smart kid. Terrifyingly smart. A pause. She's got a temperature of 104. They're running tests. The doctor says it's probably strep that went undiagnosed too long, but they want to rule other things out, and he stopped, looked at his phone. She keeps asking where I am. Ethan didn't say anything to that. Sometimes there was nothing to say, and the best thing you could offer was to work faster. He worked faster. Bum. 38 minutes after Jackson had knocked on the side door of Summit Autoworks, Ethan stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and said, "Start it." Jackson swung onto the bike with the practiced ease of a man who'd been riding for 30 years. The Harley turned over on the first try, settled into a steady, idle rear brake pedal, responsive and clean. He tested it twice, brought the engine up slightly to check the response, let it settle again. He climbed off and looked at Ethan. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing." "That's not, I didn't do it for money." Ethan met his eyes. "Go be with your daughter." Jackson stood there for a moment looking at this 32-year-old mechanic in a rain-damp Summit Autoworks shirt who had just spent 40 minutes fixing a stranger's motorcycle in a closed shop without asking for anything, and something moved across his face that was too complicated to name. He put his hand out. Ethan shook it. "I won't forget this," Jackson said. "You don't have to remember it. Just drive safe." Jackson Ryder pulled out of the Summit Autoworks parking lot at 10:53 p.m., headed north on Route 36 toward Denver, and was gone into the rain. Ethan locked up the garage, turned off the lights, and drove home. He thought the story was over. The security camera in the northeast corner of Bay 3 had been installed 18 months ago after Richard Cole found out that an employee had been doing side work on personal vehicles during company hours. It had a motion sensor and a 90-day storage loop. It covered every inch of the bay, including the parts room doorway, including the side door, including the space where Ethan Walker had spent 38 minutes working on a motorcycle that did not belong to any customer in Summit's system. Richard Cole arrived at 7:45 the next morning, as he always did, 20 minutes before the first shift, because Richard believed in being the first one in and the last one out. He was 51 years old, a self-made businessman who had bought Summit Autoworks 14 years ago as a 3-bay operation and built it into a 12-bay regional hub with a wholesale parts division. He was proud of what he'd built. I was also, and this was perhaps his defining characteristic, someone who believed deeply that systems worked and sentimentality didn't. He checked the camera footage every morning, not because he suspected anyone on staff at any given time, but because he believed in the principle of oversight. Trust in Richard Cole's worldview was something you verified. He found the breach at 7:52 a.m. He watched the footage 3 times. The side door opening, the motorcycle being walked in, the biker massive Hell's Angels vest clearly visible, sitting on a stool while one of Richard's employees used Richard's tools and Richard's parts to service a motorcycle that was not in the system, not billed, not authorized, for 38 minutes. And then this was the part that tightened something behind Richard's sternum, Ethan Walker shaking the man's hand and not taking payment. Richard sat back in his chair. I was not a cruel man. He wanted to be clear about that, at least in his own mind. He was a fair man. He was consistent. He applied the same rules to everyone, which was the only way a shop of 12 bays and 37 employees could function without descending into favoritism and chaos. If he made an exception for Ethan, he'd have to make exceptions for everyone. And if he made exceptions for everyone, he no longer had a business. Ian had a goodwill exercise funded entirely by his own balance sheet. He buzzed his office manager. "Send Ethan Walker in when he arrives." Ethan knew the moment he walked through the front door. It was something in the way Pete, the janitor, looked away too quickly. Something in the unusual quiet of the morning break room, where usually there were 3 or 4 early arrivals trading complaints about highway traffic and bad coffee. Instead, there were 2 guys who both found reasons to be looking at their phones. He'd been in trouble before, not serious trouble, but the kind of small professional friction that happened when you were someone who occasionally prioritized the right answer over the correct procedure. A written warning 2 years ago for spending an extra hour on an elderly widow's transmission because he wanted to be sure on company time. A verbal reprimand for talking back to a service advisor who Ethan was fairly certain was upselling brake jobs to customers who didn't need them. He knew the weight of an office that had already made a decision. He walked in without knocking because Richard had left the door open, which was its own kind of signal. Richard was sitting behind his desk with a coffee mug and a controlled expression, that Ethan recognized as the face of a man who had decided something and was now managing the delivery. The monitor beside him showed a still frame from the security footage. Ethan didn't need to see it clearly to know what it was. He sat down without being invited to. Security footage from last night, Richard said. I figured. You want to explain, Yes. Ethan settled back in the chair, not defensive, not aggressive, just straightforward. His daughter was in emergency in Denver. His bike seized up. He'd have been stranded with no way to get to her. I had the parts, I had the time, I had the skill, so I fixed it. Richard looked at him for a moment. You understand that's not the point. I know you think the rules are the point. They are the point. The rules protect this business. The rules protect you. If that man had been injured on a motorcycle you worked on without authorization, it was a seized caliper. The repair was straightforward. He wasn't going to be injured. You don't know that? I know brake systems. Ethan. Richard's voice dropped into a register that meant the conversation was about to change levels. I'm not debating your mechanical abilities. You're one of the best I have. I'm talking about the fact that you made a unilateral decision to open this shop after hours, use company property and inventory service, an unauthorized vehicle, and take no payment, which means this business absorbed that cost with zero return. A pause. And you did it for a man wearing a Hell's Angels vest. How was a father trying to reach his sick daughter? He was a member of an outlaw motorcycle club using your sympathy to get free labor. Something went quiet in Ethan's chest, not anger, something colder and more deliberate than anger. No, he said, he wasn't. You didn't see his face. I did. I saw the security footage. Footage doesn't show what a man looks like when he's afraid for his child. Richard stood up. He wasn't a tall man, but he had the posture of someone accustomed to the room adjusting to him. I have 37 employees watching how I handle this. If I let it go, I'm telling every one of them that the rules only apply when it's convenient, that they can decide for themselves when to open the shop after hours, when to do free work, when to let strangers in. He looked at Ethan directly. I can't do that. Even when the stranger's kid is in the hospital. Even then. He didn't look away. I'm sorry, Ethan, but I'm letting you go. Bam. The walk from Richard's office through the main floor of Summit Auto Works was one of the longest Ethan Walker had ever taken. He didn't rush it. He had his keys, his personal toolbox, which took 20 minutes to clear out because a man's tools are his tools, and nobody argued with that. His jacket, his mug, a photo from the break room bulletin board of himself, and two other mechanics at last year's 4th of July cookout. Marcus Webb, his closest friend on the floor, a 40-year-old engine specialist with forearms the size of ham hocks, and a voice that could have narrated nature documentaries found him at the toolbox and didn't say anything for a full minute, just helped him load wrenches. Then Marcus said, he's wrong. Probably, Ethan said, but it's his shop. You helped a man get to his sick kid. I broke the rules to do it. There are rules and there are rules, Ethan. Tell that to the insurance liability clause. But there was no bitterness in it, just the flatness of someone trying to be honest. He shook hands with the guys who came to say goodbye. There were 6 of them who made the effort, which told him something about who his people were. The others looked busy. He loaded his toolbox into the truck bed. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, engine off, rain still coming down, and he thought about Jackson Ryder's face in that fluorescent light, the way the fear had lived in it, the way the name Lily had come out differently than every other word. He thought about Lily's horses, all those drawings on every piece of paper in a house he'd never seen. He thought if I had to do it again, I'd do it again. He started the truck and drove home. The weeks that followed were harder than he'd expected, and he'd expected them to be hard. Richard Cole was not vindictive in the dramatic sense. He didn't make calls, didn't spread active slander, didn't do anything that could be pointed to specifically. But Cedar Ridge was not a large town, and the automotive community in the region was not a large world, and word traveled the way. Word travels in small worlds, sideways through half conversations, at trade counters and supplier visits, through the tone of a reference that was technically positive, but somehow not quite enough. Ethan applied to 7 shops in the region over the first month. He got 1 call back. The interview went well right until the last 5 minutes when the shop owner, a careful man named Garcia, who ran a clean operation in Fort Collins, said, I talked to Summit. They said you had trouble following procedures. A pause. That's not exactly what they said, but That's what I heard. I helped a man get to his sick daughter, Ethan said, after hours, without authorization. That's what happened. Garcia looked at him for a moment. That's it? That's it? You didn't steal anything. You weren't running some side deal. No, Garcia sighed. I'd hire you tomorrow if I didn't have a policy about... He stopped. Look, I'm sorry, it's not personal. I understand. Ethan drove home and sat in his kitchen for a while eating leftover rice and thinking about whether he'd been wrong. Not about the decision, he was clear on that, but about whether he'd been wrong to think that doing the right thing would somehow protect him from consequences. He was 47 days out of work when his phone rang. The number was a Denver area code he didn't recognize. Mr. Walker. The voice was calm, measured, clearly educated. Not young, not old. The voice of someone who was comfortable speaking to people he'd never met. My name is Daniel Ryder. I believe you helped my brother last month. In Cedar Ridge, in a rainstorm. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on the phone. Jackson, he said. Jackson, Daniel confirmed. He's told me the full story. I understand your employment situation has changed as a result of what you did that night. I made a choice, Ethan said carefully. There were consequences. That's how things work. Yes, Daniel said, that's how things usually work. A pause. I'd like to talk to you about something, Mr. Walker, in person if you're willing. My office is in Denver. I can send a car, or if you'd prefer to drive yourself, I can reimburse the trip. What's this about? Ethan asked, because he was not someone who likes suspense. It's about what kind of person you are, Daniel said, and whether that person is available. There was a moment in which Ethan almost said he'd think about it. I can be there Thursday, he said instead. Thursday is perfect. A pause, and something in Daniel Ryder's voice shifted, something genuine surfacing beneath the composed executive tone. Mr. Walker, my niece is home from the hospital. She's drawing horses again. I thought you should know that. Ethan looked out his kitchen window at the November sky over Cedar Ridge, the mountains gray and immovable in the distance. Good, he said. That's really good. He hung up the phone. He sat there for a long time. He thought, I have no idea what Thursday will bring. He thought, Jackson made it. Lily is home. That's enough. That was always going to be enough. But the thing he didn't think, the thing he couldn't have known to think, was that the phone call he'd just taken was not the beginning of a thank you. It was the beginning of everything else. Thursday came with the kind of cold that gets into your joints before you're fully awake. Ethan was up at 5:30, not because he'd set an alarm, but because he hadn't really slept. He'd been lying in the dark, running the conversation with Daniel Ryder back through his head, parsing the words. The way he parsed engine sounds, listening for what was underneath, for what the surface noise was covering. It's about what kind of person you are, and whether that person is available. He'd heard those words maybe 40 times since Tuesday night. He still didn't know what they meant exactly. What he knew was that Daniel Ryder wasn't a name he'd recognized on the call, but it was a name he'd recognized immediately after, because he'd spent 20 minutes online and discovered that Ryder Automotive Group was not a local operation, not a regional chain, not anything that fit comfortably in the same mental category as Summit AutoWorks. It was a 37-location automotive services and dealership group with a wholesale parts division and a corporate fleet management arm, privately held, based in Denver. Annual revenue that the business publications estimated somewhere north of $400 million. Jackson Ryder's brother ran a $400 million company. Ethan had sat with that for a while. Then he'd gone to bed and stared at the ceiling. He dressed carefully on Thursday morning, not in the overdone way of someone trying to impress, but in the deliberate way of someone who understood that clothes communicate before you open your mouth, and who wanted his to communicate that he was serious without being someone he wasn't. Clean dark jeans, a button-down shirt, dark gray, his good boots, which he'd had resoled twice because they were quality, and he believed in maintaining quality things. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for about 4 seconds, decided that was enough, and got in his truck. The drive to Denver took just under 2 hours. He used the time to think, and when he was done thinking, he used it to not think, which he was also reasonably good at. There was something about driving long distances through mountain country that allowed a particular kind of mental emptiness, not blankness exactly, but the clearing of noise, the way a room feels after you open a window and let the air move through. I thought about his father, who had been a mechanic before him, who had run a two-bay shop in a town smaller than Cedar Ridge for 30 years and retired with enough to live on and a reputation that meant something. His father had told him once when Ethan was about 15 and complaining that a customer had stiffed the shop on a bill, "You do good work because you do good work, not because of what comes back." He'd believed that. He still believed it. But he was also 47 days unemployed with a truck payment and a lease renewal coming, and belief, it turned out, didn't cover those things. He found the Ryder Automotive Group headquarters without difficulty. It occupied the top 3 floors of the building in the Cherry Creek district, and the lobby had the particular quality of spaces designed to communicate arrival. Not ostentatious, not the kind of thing that shouted money, but precise and well-considered in a way that made everything in it feel purposeful. The woman at the front desk said his name before he gave it, which meant Daniel's people had been watching for him, which told him something. I was taken up by a man named Kevin, who wore a company badge and moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who spent his days managing the gap between executive time and civilian time. Kevin offered coffee twice and didn't seem offended when Ethan declined both times. The office he was brought to was on the top floor. Corner. 2 walls of glass looking out over the city and the mountains beyond it, which on a clear day like this were extraordinary. The kind of view that reminded you the world was larger than whatever you happened to be worried about. Ethan noticed the view, then he looked at the man standing in front of it. Daniel Ryder was 54 years old and looked like a man who had made peace with what he was, which was not always how wealth aged people. He was tall without being imposing, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that held its own history without apology. He was wearing a jacket over an open-collar shirt, no tie, which in Ethan's experience meant either he'd already finished his important meetings for the day or he deliberately didn't want this to feel like one. He crossed the room with his hand out before Ethan had fully entered the space. "Mr. Walker, thank you for making the drive." Ethan said, shaking it. "Daniel." He gestured toward a pair of chairs arranged near the window away from the desk. A deliberate choice, no desk between them, no executive staging. "Please." They sat. Kevin reappeared briefly with water and then was gone. Daniel looked at Ethan with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what he saw, not performing interest. "Jackson called me the night it happened," he said. "He was on the road to Denver. He said, 'I need to tell you about a mechanic in Cedar Ridge.' I told him to drive and call me back. He called me back from the hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning. Ethan didn't say anything. "He told me what you did. The repair, obviously. But also," Daniel paused and something in his expression shifted into something more personal. "He told me that you looked at him, that you actually looked at him, not at the vest." "The vest doesn't tell you who somebody is," Ethan said. "No, it doesn't." Daniel nodded slowly. "But most people don't know that, or they know it intellectually and don't manage to feel it in the actual moment when they're face to face with a man. Jackson sighs wearing Hell's Angels colors in a dark parking lot in a rainstorm." He looked at Ethan directly. "Jackson has been a member for 19 years. He has a daughter in a co-parenting situation and a mortgage in a kitchen that smells like horse-shaped cookies because Lily insists on making them every other Sunday. He is also a man who most people decide they have understood before he opens his mouth. You didn't." "I heard the engine," Ethan said. "I knew something was wrong before I saw him. By the time I saw him, I was already thinking about the repair. And then I saw his face. And you saw a father." "I saw a father," Ethan agreed. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I started this company 22 years ago with one location and a significant amount of debt," he said. "The hardest thing I've had to figure out, not the financing, not the expansion, not the market changes, is people. Who to trust. Who has the thing you can't teach." He looked at Ethan. "You can't teach what you did that night. I can train a mechanic. I can train someone to manage inventory, to read diagnostic software, to handle customers. I cannot train a person to see another person clearly under pressure and do the right thing because it's right." Ethan said, "You're going to offer me a job." Daniel smiled briefly. "I was working up to it with slightly more rhetorical grace, but yes." "What kind?" "Lead diagnostic mechanic at our Denver service center. It's our largest location. It's also our most troubled location, which I'll get to in a moment." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "The role involves direct service work, but it also involves managing workflow, working with the floor team and being a resource for the other technicians. It's not a pure wrench-turning job. It's a people job that also involves a lot of wrenching. Ethan looked at him for a moment. What kind of trouble are we talking about? Daniel took a breath. Turnover is the obvious metric. We've had 3 service managers in 18 months. Good people on the floor who have stopped performing at the level they're capable of for reasons I suspect, but haven't been able to fully diagnose from where I sit. He paused. The revenue numbers are down 23% year over year. Customer satisfaction scores are the lowest in the group. And I keep getting reports that are technically correct and somehow don't tell me the real story. What do you think the real story is? Daniel looked at him steadily. I think the real story is that something is wrong in the culture of that location. Something systemic, something that has been there long enough that people have stopped noticing it or stopped expecting it to change. A pause. I've sent consultants. They produce reports. The reports describe what I can already see from the numbers. Nobody has told me why. And you think I can tell you why? I think you can do something better than tell me why. I think you can walk into that shop and see it the way you saw Jackson in that parking lot. Not the surface, what's underneath. Ethan sat back in his chair. He turned this over. Can I ask you something? He said, please. Your brother, does he know you're doing this? Did he ask you to? Daniel shook his head. Jackson told me what happened. He didn't ask me to do anything. He said, he paused, and again something personal surfaced in his expression. He said that mechanic lost his job because of me. I don't know what to do about that. And he genuinely didn't. Jackson is not a man who moves in corporate circles. He doesn't think in terms of opportunities and positions. He was just carrying the weight of it. So this is your idea? This is entirely my idea. Daniel looked at him directly. But it's not charity. I want that to be clear. I'm not offering you a position out of sentiment. I'm offering you a position because I spent 3 days investigating you before I made this call, and everything I found told me you're someone I want in my organization. Ethan went still. 3 days, he said. I talked to customers from Summit AutoWorks, not management customers. I found 6 people who specifically requested you by name for service work. I talked to a woman named Patricia Huang who said you spent 90 minutes with her explaining a repair in terms she could understand because she told you she'd been overcharged at a previous shop and didn't trust the industry anymore. I talked to a man named Gerald Okafor who said you caught a brake issue on his truck that 2 other shops had missed and that you called him at home to make sure his family had gotten back safely after a road trip. He paused. I talked to Marcus Webb who worked with you at Summit. What did Marcus say? He said Ethan's the best mechanic I've ever worked with and a better human being than I'll ever manage to be, and whoever told you different is protecting their own ego. Daniel's mouth curved slightly. He was fairly emphatic. Something moved in Ethan's chest at that. He kept his face even. The position, Ethan said. You mentioned a salary. Daniel named a number. Ethan kept his face even about that too, which required slightly more effort because the number Daniel named was 40% higher than what he'd been making at Summit. Benefits, obviously, Daniel added. Relocation if you need it. And I want to be transparent about one thing. He leaned forward. This is not a situation where I'm looking for someone to follow a playbook. If I wanted that, I have people for it. What I'm looking for is someone who will walk into that location, understand what's actually happening there, and have the judgment and the guts to address it. Even if addressing it is uncomfortable. Even if the people who need to be addressed have been there longer than you. Ethan looked at him. You're not just looking for a mechanic. No, Daniel said, I'm not, but I need the mechanic too. He smiled, and this time it was fuller. The role description says lead diagnostic mechanic because I have to put something on the form. Ethan thought about Richard Cole's office, the security footage still on the monitor, the walk across the floor with his toolbox. I thought about 47 days of silence from shops in a region where people apparently knew things about him that weren't quite right and weren't quite wrong. He thought about his father. You do good work because you do good work. I have a condition, Ethan said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. All right, the mechanic's already working there. Whatever I find, whatever I change, I want the floor workers to have a real voice in it. Not a survey, not a suggestion box. An actual conversation where I listen and what they say matters to what happens next. Daniel looked at him for a moment. That's your condition. That's my condition. Not a higher salary, not a title change. The title's fine, the salary is more than fair. Ethan looked at him directly. But if I walk into a shop where good people have been ignored long enough to stop caring and I implement changes without actually hearing them, I'm just Richard Cole with a different company logo. The silence that followed that was about 4 seconds long, and in those 4 seconds, Daniel Ryder looked at Ethan Walker with the expression of a man who had just confirmed something he'd been hoping to confirm. Done, Daniel said simply. They shook hands across the space between the chairs. No desk, no ceremony, no paperwork. Yet just two men who'd looked at each other clearly and decided. Ethan drove home to Cedar Ridge. He sat in his apartment and looked at the walls for a while. Then he called Marcus. Got a job, he said when Marcus picked up. A pause. Tell me. Ryder Automotive, Denver, lead diagnostic. Silence. Marcus? I'm trying to figure out if you were joking. I'm not joking. Ryder Automotive Group, as in Daniel Ryder, as in the man whose company has 37 locations and whose name is on half the diagnostic equipment we were using at Summit. Jackson's his brother. Jackson, another pause, this one longer. The biker. The father, Ethan said. He could hear Marcus processing this. He could almost hear the moment it clicked into something Marcus could hold. You fixed his bike, Marcus said slowly. In the rain, after closing, and it cost you your job. And now his brother is handing you the lead position at a 40-location automotive group. 37 locations. Ethan. What? You're the luckiest unlucky person I have ever met. Ethan thought about that. I don't think it's luck, he said. I don't know. I think it's that the right thing and the smart thing turn out to be the same thing more often than people expect. They just don't always work on the timeline you want. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Your dad used to say something like that. Yeah, Ethan said. He did. He started packing 2 days later. He didn't have much the toolbox, which was significant and required careful loading. Some furniture that wasn't worth the trouble of moving and could be replaced. Books, clothes, a framed photograph of his parents at his high school graduation that had lived on his nightstand for 12 years. He took one final walk through the apartment, which he'd lived in for 4 years and which had never fully felt like his in the way that some spaces don't. And he decided he wasn't sad to leave it. He stopped at Summit Auto Works on his way out of town. Not to go in, he pulled into the lot and sat for a minute, looking at the building from outside the bay doors, the sign that he'd seen almost every morning for 3 years. I didn't feel anger. He'd expected he might sitting there, but he didn't. What he felt was something closer to clarity. Richard Cole had made his decision according to his understanding of the world, and his understanding wasn't entirely wrong, it just didn't include the parts of the world that Ethan thought were most important. That wasn't evil, it was limitation. He'd learned long ago that understanding something doesn't mean forgiving it, but it means you can put it down. He put it down. He pulled out of the lot and pointed the truck south toward Denver. I was on the floor of the Ryder Automotive Denver Service Center at 7 a.m. on Monday. Not in the office, not at the service desk. On the floor in bay clothes he'd brought from his own truck, standing next to a diagnostic station that was connected to a 2021 Ford F-250 with a transmission fault code that 3 other technicians had apparently looked at over the past week without resolution. I didn't announce himself. The service center manager, a thin, nervous man named Phil Garrett, who'd been in the position for 4 months and who clearly hadn't been told exactly who Ethan was or what his actual function would be, had given him a brief tour and then retreated to his office with the look of a man who was waiting for a verdict he hadn't consented to receive. The rest of the floor had 12 active technicians. Ethan watched them for the first 40 minutes without engaging, not performing invisibility, not hiding, just working the diagnostic on the F-250 and paying attention the way you pay attention when you care about what you're seeing. What he saw was this 12 technically capable people performing at about 60% of what they were capable of. He could see it in the pace and the small hesitations before using equipment, in the way nobody offered opinions to anyone else, in the complete absence of the particular kind of noise. A healthy shop floor makes not loudness exactly, but aliveness. The sound of people who are engaged in communicating and throwing ideas at each other. This floor was quiet in the wrong way. A young woman in a technician's uniform was working alone at a diagnostic terminal 2 bays over. She was fast, genuinely fast, with the focused economy of motion that you don't teach and can't fake. And she was also, Ethan noticed, completely isolated. Nobody approached her station, nobody spoke to her, she spoke to no one. She worked in a pocket of professional silence that felt less like preference and more like something that had been enforced by absence of acknowledgement until it became habit. He finished the F-250 diagnosis. It was a faulty torque converter solenoid, which the code pointed to and the data confirmed, and he was puzzled that 3 other people had looked at it and not pulled that conclusion and walked his printout to the service desk. Phil was waiting there with his clipboard and his worried eyes. The F-250, Ethan said. Torque converter solenoid. Here's the full data. He slid the printout across. Can I ask you something? Of course. Phil's voice had the quality of someone very carefully not asking questions of his own. That technician in Bay 7, the woman running the diagnostic solo, what's her name? Phil blinked. Olivia Carter. She's been here about 14 months. What's her background? She came out of the Denver Technical Institute program. 2-year certification. Phil paused. She's fine. She does her work. She's the fastest technician on this floor. And her diagnostic accuracy looks sharper than anyone else I've seen this morning, Ethan said. What does she usually get assigned? Phil shifted his weight slightly. We distribute work based on there's a rotation system. What does she usually get assigned? Phil, a pause. Basic maintenance, oil changes, tire rotations, some brake jobs. Ethan let that sit for exactly long enough. Who decides the assignments? The previous service manager had a system. I've been maintaining it. The previous manager, the one before you? Yes. Who's been here 4 months now? That's right. Ethan nodded. He didn't say anything else about it yet. He took the F-250 printout back and went to find Olivia Carter. She looked up when he approached with the slightly braced quality of someone accustomed to being interrupted by management for reasons that weren't compliments. Olivia, he put out his hand. Ethan Walker, I'm new here. She shook it carefully. I heard. I was watching your work this morning. You're running the diagnostic sequence faster than the protocol calls for. You're comfortable skipping the redundant verification steps because you've already processed the data and you know they're redundant. He paused. How often do you get to do that kind of work? She looked at him with a measuring expression. Not suspicious exactly, more like someone who had learned to correctly assess before investing. Not very often, she said. What do you usually get at a beat? Maintenance rotation. You have a degree in automotive diagnostics and you're doing oil changes. I have a certification, she said. 2 years. Olivia, do you want to tell me what's actually happening on this floor? Because I've been here 3 hours and I'm already seeing the outline of it, but I'd rather hear it from someone who's been living it for 14 months. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not with any display, but something moved the way something moves in a room when you finally say the true thing out loud. You want the real version, she said, always. Then you should probably also talk to Thomas Reed, she said. He's in Bay 11. He's been here 25 years. 25 years. He's the best engine diagnostician I've ever seen work. He could be running this floor. A pause. He changes oil too. Ethan stood very still. How long has this been going on? Olivia's jaw tightened slightly. Since before I got here, she said. It's just, that's how it works. The assignments come down, you do the assignments, and if you do them well, you get the same ones the next day. She looked directly at him, and there was something fierce underneath the control surface. People stopped asking for more, because asking didn't change anything. It's going to change something now, Ethan said. She held his gaze for a moment. People have said things like that before, she said carefully. It wasn't hostile. It was the honest response of someone who had learned to calibrate hope. Fair enough, Ethan said. Then don't take my word for it. Give me 2 weeks. He went to find Thomas Reed. Thomas Reed was 61 years old and had the hands of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. He was working methodically on an engine teardown, and he had the quality of complete absorption that you see in people who have made peace with their work, even if they haven't made peace with the circumstances around it. He looked up when Ethan appeared at the edge of his bay with the alert calm of someone who doesn't startle easily. Thomas Reed, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. That's right. Thomas looked at him without expression, not unfriendly, not friendly, waiting. I'm Ethan Walker. I started today. I heard. A pause. Another manager. Lead diagnostic. Not exactly a manager. Thomas's eyes moved over him with the systematic efficiency of a man who had assessed many people in this way over 25 years. What do you want? I want to know what this floor needs. A silence. Thomas set down his tool very carefully, the way careful people set things down when they're deciding how to speak. Nobody's asked me that in a while, he said. I'm asking now. Thomas Reed looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment something happened that Ethan recognized from experience, the particular internal calculation of someone deciding whether the person in front of them was worth the risk of honesty. All right, Thomas said finally. You want to know what this floor needs? He crossed his arms, not defensively but thoughtfully, the way a man holds himself when he's being deliberate. It needs someone to look at what's actually here. The talent, the experience, not the numbers on a productivity sheet. His voice was even measured, but there was weight behind it. I have been doing engine diagnostics for longer than some of these kids have been alive. I have forgotten more about powertrain systems than most of them will ever learn. And for the past 3 years, I have been assigned work that a first-year tech out of a trade school could handle in their sleep. Why? Ethan said. Because the manager before Phil didn't like questions, Thomas said. And I ask questions. When something doesn't make sense, I say so. When a procedure is outdated, I say so. When an assignment doesn't match the problem, I say so. He paused. Apparently that's inconvenient. So he sidelined you. He sidelined me. And when you sideline the person who asks the hardest questions, everyone else learns not to ask them. And when nobody asks hard questions, he stopped, looked at Ethan steadily. You get a shop where everyone does exactly what they're told, and nothing works as well as it should. The truth of it settled in the air between them. Ethan thought about Richard Cole, about rules and exceptions, and the way systems calcify around the comfort of the people running them, rather than the needs of the people working inside them. Okay, Ethan said. Thomas blinked slightly. He'd clearly expected more resistance, more institutional language, more of the careful non-commitment he'd heard before. Okay, he said. You're right, and it's going to change. Ethan looked at him directly. I need you to trust me long enough to give me the room to change it. Can you do that? A pause that lasted about as long as Thomas Reed needed to decide. You've been here one morning, Thomas said. I know. You're going to tell me it's different this time. I'm going to tell you, I've seen what's happening here, and I've seen what it costs people, and I'm not willing to leave it the way I found it. Ethan held his gaze. That's all I'm going to tell you. Thomas Reed looked at him for a long time. Then he uncrossed his arms. 2 weeks, he said. I'll give you 2 weeks before I decide what I think. That's all I'm asking, Ethan said. He walked back to the diagnostic station with the F-250 printout in his hand and the clear, cold understanding of what he'd walked into. Not a broken mechanical operation, but a broken human one. A floor full of capable people who had been systematically taught that their capabilities didn't matter. The anger was there. He didn't pretend it wasn't. But underneath the anger was something he recognized as the same feeling he'd had in the rainstorm, standing at the side door of Summit Auto Works, hearing an engine in trouble and knowing he could fix it. He'd walked in then. He walked in now. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known yet, was that the man who had started all of this was not finished. Because Richard Cole had heard about the new position at Ryder Automotive. And Richard Cole, who believed in systems and rules and the necessity of precedent, had decided that the story of Ethan Walker needed a different ending than the one it seemed to be writing for itself. Richard Cole made his first move on a Wednesday. Ethan had been at Ryder Automotive's Denver Service Center for 11 days. 11 days of 6 a.m. arrivals and 9 p.m. departures. 11 days of conversations that began stiffly and ended differently. 11 days of watching people like Thomas Reed and Olivia Carter start to remember that they were good at what they did, which was its own kind of quiet miracle, the way a plant straightens toward light that it hadn't been sure was real. I didn't know about Richard's move until Thursday morning when Daniel Ryder called him at 7:15 and said, "Are you in the building?" "Just walked in," Ethan said. "Come up when you have a minute." The tone was the kind of calm that people with serious things to say use to make sure you don't panic before you've heard the actual information. Ethan recognized it. He put his jacket on the hook in the bay and went upstairs. Daniel was standing when Ethan entered, which meant he'd been moving around, which meant he'd been thinking hard enough that sitting felt wrong. Richard Cole contacted our regional VP of operations yesterday afternoon, Daniel said. He didn't lead up to it. He presented himself as a concerned industry colleague. He said he felt it was his professional obligation to share some information about a former employee before that employee's probationary period concluded. Ethan sat down. What information? That you have a documented history of disregarding workplace safety protocols. That you performed unauthorized work on a vehicle with known liability implications. That you were terminated for cause rather than as a business decision. Daniel paused. And that he has security footage to support all of it. The room was very quiet. He's not lying, Ethan said carefully, about the footage. The rest of it is framing. I know that. Daniel sat down across from him. I've seen the footage myself. My team pulled it within 6 hours of his call. He looked at Ethan steadily. Ethan, I know what you did and why you did it. My confidence in you hasn't moved. But I need you to understand what's happening because Richard Cole is not finished. And I don't think he fully understands who he's dealing with yet on either side of this. What does he want? Daniel's expression tightened slightly. That's what's interesting. He didn't make any explicit ask. He positioned it entirely as professional courtesy, warning a colleague about a hire. A pause, which means either he genuinely believes he's protecting the industry from a reckless employee or he's opening a negotiation he hasn't named yet. Or both, Ethan said. Or both, Daniel agreed. Ethan looked at the table between them. He thought about Richard in his office with the controlled expression and the security footage on the monitor. He thought about the walk across the floor with his toolbox. He tried to locate something that felt like surprise and found that it wasn't there. He needs this to have been the right call, Ethan said slowly. Firing me. If I succeed here, if what happened at Summit leads directly to something better, then his decision looks wrong. And Richard Cole is a man who built his business on the premise that his decisions are right. Daniel looked at him for a moment. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. Ethan looked up. I'm not saying he's a good man or a bad man. I'm saying he's a man who's built his identity around a particular understanding of how the world works, and I'm currently a piece of evidence that challenges it. So he's trying to eliminate the evidence. He's trying to rewrite it. Ethan paused. It's different. Daniel studied him. What do you want to do about it? Nothing yet, Ethan said. I want to finish what I started on the floor. The rest of it. He stopped. Thought, let him talk. A man who needs to protect his ego by going to competitors about a fired mechanic is already telling people who he is. I don't need to help that story. Daniel nodded slowly. All right, he stood. But Ethan, I need you to know this company will not act on his complaint. Not now. I wanted you to hear that from me directly. I appreciate that. Don't just appreciate it. Believe it and go to work. Ethan went to work. He walked back into the service center with the information sitting in his chest, like a coal not burning, yet but warm, and he was aware of it in the way you're aware of something that might require your full attention later. He filed it in the part of his mind where he put things he couldn't fix immediately and went to find Thomas Reed. Thomas was already in his bay, had been there since before Ethan arrived, which was becoming a pattern. In the past 11 days, Thomas had started showing up earlier than he had in years, which Ethan knew because Rose at the front desk had mentioned it with the tone of someone who found it notable. I have something for you, Ethan said, and handed him a printed diagnostic assignment. Thomas looked at it. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle straightening, the physical language of a man who has been asked to stand at full height when he's been stooping for a long time. This is the Callahan Fleet contract, Thomas said. It is. That's a full engine evaluation series, 12 vehicles. 14 now, they added 2 semis last night. Thomas looked at the printout, then he looked at Ethan. You're giving me the Callahan contract. I'm assigning our best engine diagnostician to the most complex engine diagnostic job we have. Ethan looked at him steadily, which is what should have been happening for the past 3 years. A silence. Thomas's jaw worked once very slightly, the way people's faces move when they're processing something that has cost them more than they've said. I'll need an assistant, Thomas said. His voice was even, professional, but his hands, his large, scarred, capable hands, had closed briefly around the printout and then deliberately relaxed. Olivia Carter's been reassigned to advanced diagnostics effective this morning. I'll let her know she's working with you. Thomas was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to mean something. Ethan. Yeah, thank you. It was 2 words, and it carried 25 years in it. Ethan nodded once and left him to his work. He found Olivia at her station and told her about the reassignment. She looked at the work order, then she looked at Ethan with an expression he was starting to recognize from both her and Thomas, the look of someone who had been waiting for something to be real before they let themselves feel it. Thomas Reed, she said. Thomas Reed. I used to watch him work, she said quietly. Before I got put on the maintenance rotation, I used to find reasons to walk past his bay because watching him diagnose an engine was like, she stopped, pressed her lips together once, started again. It was like watching someone read a book that nobody else in the room knew existed. Then get over there, Ethan said. He's waiting. She went. He stood for a moment and listened to the floor around him, the mechanical conversation of a space that was slowly learning to be alive again, and underneath the normal sounds, the impact guns, the lifts, the diagnostic terminals. He thought he heard something else, the sound of a floor that was starting to work. He was still listening when Phil Garrett appeared at his elbow. Phil had been getting progressively more nervous over the past week and a half in direct proportion to how much Ethan was changing. Not sabotaging Phil was not a saboteur, but in the specific way of someone who had managed by maintaining existing systems and was now watching existing systems get reorganized by someone who outranked him in ways that hadn't been clearly defined. Can I ask you something? Phil said. Sure. The Callahan assignment, that should have gone through my scheduling system. I know. I'll make sure the paperwork reflects it. Ethan looked at him. Phil, what's your read on this floor after 4 months? Phil blinked. He clearly hadn't expected a question back. There are some process issues. The assignment rotation needs updating. The customer intake system has some redundancies. What's wrong with the people? Ethan asked. Phil went quiet. That's not meant as an accusation, Ethan said. I'm genuinely asking. You've been watching this floor for 4 months. What's your read on the people? A pause. Phil was looking at his clipboard, which he held the way some people hold a phone when they're uncomfortable as a thing to look at that isn't a face. They're good, he said finally. They're all good. Some of them are very good. He paused again. They don't talk to each other much. There's not a lot of, he searched for the word, collaboration. Why do you think that is? Phil looked up from the clipboard. And for the first time since Ethan had arrived, Phil Garrett looked like a man with an actual opinion instead of a man managing an administrative situation. Because the person before me made it safer to keep your head down, he said. I figured that out in about week 2. The problem was I didn't know how to change it without, he stopped. Without authority, Ethan said. Without authority, Phil agreed, and without wanting to step on anything that had already been set up. Ethan looked at him. Phil, you have authority. You're the service manager. I know that technically. Then start using it untechnically. Ethan looked at him steadily. I'm not here to replace you. I'm here to fix what's broken on the floor. But the floor reports to you, and you need to be the one they trust. That means they need to see you making decisions that protect them. Phil absorbed that. What kind of decisions? Start by making sure everyone knows that the assignment system is changing. Not as my decision as yours, because you've seen what the old system was doing to the team. Phil looked at him for a moment. You're asking me to own this, he said. I'm asking you to lead your shop, Ethan said. There was a long pause. Then Phil squared his shoulders in a way that was small and specific and completely genuine. All right, he said, and walked back to his office to start. Ethan turned back to the floor. I was halfway through his own diagnostic assignment, a 23 Chevy Silverado with an intermittent electrical fault that had been misdiagnosed twice when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he'd stored under Marcus Webb. It said Cole was in Fort Collins yesterday. Talked to Garcia. Don't know what he said, but Garcia looked uncomfortable when I mentioned your name this morning. Ethan read it twice, set the phone face down on the diagnostic cart, picked up his scanner and went back to work. The Silverado's fault turned out to be a corroded ground connection behind the firewall, invisible on the surface, causing intermittent chaos across 6 unrelated systems. The kind of thing that drove diagnosticians crazy because it mimicked the signatures of a dozen different problems without being any of them. Classic misdirection. Classic underlying truth hiding behind a wall of symptoms. He found it by following the logic backward from effect to cause without letting the false patterns distract him. He sat back on his heels in the bay and thought not for the first time that cars and people had this in common. The presenting problem was almost never the actual problem. He wrote up the repair, he filed it, he texted Marcus back, let him talk. How's Summit? Marcus's response took a few minutes. Weird without you. Cole's been in early every day. Something's off with him, but nobody knows what. Ethan thought about that. A man who builds his world around being right now, watching the mechanic. He fired getting rebuilt into something larger than Summit AutoWorks ever was. A man who reached out to a regional VP and a Fort Collins shop owner in the same week. What did that tell you? It told you the fear was real. Not manufactured, not strategic real. Richard Cole was afraid people made moves that revealed more than they concealed. The question was what they revealed. He didn't have to wait long for the answer, because on Friday afternoon, 3 days after Daniel's call, Ethan's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered it. Ethan Walker. A pause on the other end, brief. Then, this is Richard Cole. The shop noise around Ethan didn't change. The impact guns ran. The lifts hummed. He walked to the quieter end of the floor, not rushing, and said, Richard. I'll be direct, Richard said. I've heard you've taken a position at Ryder Automotive. That's right. I want you to know that the calls I've made this week were professional in nature. I wasn't trying to damage your career. I was trying to ensure that the circumstances of your departure from Summit were understood correctly. Ethan waited. I'd like to meet, Richard said, if you're willing. Wipe on a pause that was longer this time, because I think there are things that were left unsaid. Ethan looked across the floor where Olivia was bent over a diagnostic terminal beside Thomas Reed, and Thomas was pointing at something on the screen and saying something that made her nod quickly and pull up a different data set, and both of them were completely absorbed in the work. The way people get when they've finally got the problem they're capable of solving. I'll meet you, Ethan said. Next week, you come to Denver. Another pause. All right, Richard, Ethan's voice was level. Whatever you've said to Garcia and the Ryder Regional VP, I'm not coming to the meeting to litigate that. I'm coming because I think you actually have something real to say, and you're not saying it yet. Silence, though. Then quietly, maybe so. Next week, Ethan said, I'll text you an address. He hung up. He stood for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he put it in his pocket and went back to work because the floor needed him, and the floor was what mattered. And Richard Cole, whatever he was carrying, would still be carrying it next week. He spent the rest of Friday in a series of conversations that would have been impossible 11 days ago. Thomas Reed talking through the Callahan engine protocol with Olivia and 2 other technicians who'd started gravitating toward their bay as the word spread very quietly that something interesting was happening there. Phil holding an actual team meeting, the first one in his 4 months that lasted 40 minutes and in which 5 people said things they'd been not saying for much longer than 4 months. A young technician named Darius, who'd been with the location for 8 months, and who turned out to have an extraordinary instinct for electrical systems, who Ethan had been watching all week and who visibly recalibrated something in himself when Ethan sat down beside his terminal on Friday afternoon and said, Walk me through how you're thinking about this fault. Nobody's ever asked me that, Darius said. He was 24 and trying not to show how much that had cost him. I'm asking now, Ethan said. Go. And Darius went, and what came out of him in the next 20 minutes was precise and logical and creative, in the specific way of someone who'd been solving problems privately for months because nobody had made space for him to solve them publicly. You should be running training sessions on electrical diagnostics, Ethan said when he was done. Darius laughed once short. I'm the junior tech. You're the best electrical diagnostician on this floor. Seniority and skill aren't the same thing. Ethan looked at him. Would you be willing to run a session informal? Just the techs. A pause in which Darius was clearly trying to figure out whether this was real. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, I'd do that. Set it up with Phil next Thursday morning before the floor opens. I went home that Friday evening, feeling something he identified after a moment as the particular satisfaction of watching a mechanism start to work the way it was designed to, not complete yet not finished, but moving. The gears engaging, the load transferring properly. I thought about his father's two-bay shop. about the people who'd come through it over 30 years, not just with broken vehicles, but with the particular human need to have someone capable look at your problem and say, I can fix this. He thought about Jackson in the rain. He thought one decision, one wet night in a closed garage, and look at where the thread leads. He was still thinking about it when his phone rang again just past 8 p.m. It was Marcus. Ethan. His voice had a quality Ethan hadn't heard before. Tight. Something happened today. At Summit. Tell me. Cole called a meeting this afternoon, full staff. He told everyone the shop is going through a strategic review. Possible restructuring. A pause. Ethan, 3 of the senior techs are already talking about leaving. They think it's the beginning of layoffs. Ethan sat forward. Is it? I don't know, but Cole looked, I don't know how to describe it. He looked like a man who was trying to control something that had already gotten away from him. Ethan thought about that. He thought about Richard calling him directly. The quality in his voice when he'd said maybe so. Not the voice of a man executing a strategy. The voice of a man who'd lost his footing and was trying to find something to hold on to. Marcus, he said, keep me informed and tell the guys who are talking about leaving to hold on a week. Why a week? Because I'm meeting with Richard next week and I want to hear what he actually says before anyone makes any decisions. A pause. You're meeting with Cole? Yeah. Ethan, the man tried to torch your new job. I know what he did. Ethan looked out his window at the Denver night. But I think he's scared, and scared people sometimes tell you things that the composed version of themselves never would. And what are you going to do with it? I don't know yet, Ethan said honestly, but I want to hear it. He hung up and sat in the quiet of his new apartment, smaller than the Cedar Ridge place, but his chosen something about it that felt like the beginning of a space rather than the continuation of one. And he turned the whole week over in his mind like an engine he was trying to listen to. Richard Cole reaching out to the regional VP. Richard Cole talking to Garcia in Fort Collins. Cole calling Summit's floor together for a restructuring meeting. Richard Cole picking up his phone on a Friday night and dialing Ethan Walker's number. These were not the moves of a man protecting his business. These were the moves of a man who was falling. And underneath all of it, under the calls and the footage and the professional courtesy framing, there was something Ethan had been circling without landing on until this moment. Richard hadn't fired him to protect Summit Auto Works. Richard had fired him because of the vest. Not explicitly, not with awareness, but the decision that he'd defended with liability language and rule enforcement language in the system must be consistent language. That decision had been made in the 3 seconds Richard Cole spent looking at the security footage and seeing a Hells Angels vest in his shop. He'd seen the vest and decided the rest before he'd opened his mouth, just like everyone else. And Ethan, who had specifically not done that, who had looked past the vest and seen the father and made a decision that cost him his job. Ethan was now standing in a position that Richard Cole, with all his rules and systems, could not have built for himself. The irony was not lost. But the thing that wasn't irony, the thing that Ethan sat with in the quiet Friday night apartment until well past midnight, was the question of what it cost a man to build his whole identity around the idea that he was right and then watch the evidence accumulate that he wasn't. He'd seen that cost on his father's face once in a different context, on the face of a customer at Summit who'd come in certain his engine was shot, certain Ethan would confirm it, and had to sit with the strange discomfort of being told it was a $15 sensor. Richard Cole had built 23 years of decisions on a particular understanding of people. And the mechanic he'd fired for breaking the rules had just walked into one of the largest automotive groups in the region on the strength of what those broken rules had revealed about his character. That was a hard thing to carry. Ethan thought, I don't know if I can make that easier for him. He thought, but I'm going to find out what happens if I try. He set his phone on the nightstand. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about Lily drawing horses on every piece of paper in a house he'd never seen, and about the way Jackson had said her name in the fluorescent light of a closed garage softly, the way you say something that matters. He closed his eyes. He slept. And 3 states of mind away. Richard Cole was in his office at Summit Auto Works alone, long after everyone else had gone home, watching security footage on a loop, and not the footage of Ethan and the motorcycle, but older footage of a floor that had once had a particular aliveness to it that it hadn't quite managed to hold on to. And thinking for the first time in a very long time that maybe the problem with rules was not that people broke them. Maybe the problem was the man who wrote them. The meeting was set for Tuesday at noon. Ethan had picked a diner 2 blocks from the Ryder Automotive Building. Neutral ground, not corporate, not a place that would feel like a power move in either direction. Booth's good coffee, the kind of background noise that kept a hard conversation from feeling like a performance. He arrived 10 minutes early, took a booth in the back, ordered coffee, and waited. Richard walked in at noon exactly. He looked smaller than Ethan remembered. Not physically, Richard was still the same mid-height, composed, well-dressed man he'd always been. But there was something in his bearing that had compressed, like air had gone out of something that had previously been held firm by pressure. He saw Ethan and crossed the diner without hesitation, which told Ethan something. He'd made the decision to do this cleanly, whatever this turned out to be. He sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The server came, Richard ordered coffee, and they waited until she was gone. Then Richard said, "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said, "but I'll listen to whatever you want to say." Richard wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. It was the gesture of a man who needed something to hold on to. "When I saw the footage," he began, then stopped. Tried again. "When I saw the footage, I told myself it was about the rules, the liability, the principle that exceptions create chaos." He looked at Ethan directly. "And I believed that. In the moment, I fully believed it." "But," Ethan said, "but the footage showed me a man in a Hell's Angels vest in my shop after hours." Richard paused. "And the speed at which I made the decision, the absolute certainty, I felt it wasn't about the rules, not entirely." He looked down at his coffee. "I've been running Summit for 23 years, and I've prided myself on consistency, on fairness, on applying the same standards to every situation." He was quiet for a moment. "I watched that footage and I saw what you did, and I had the verdict ready before I'd finished watching." "You saw the vest," Ethan said. "I saw the vest," Richard confirmed. His jaw tightened once. "And I constructed everything else around that first reaction." A beat. "That's not fairness. That's not consistency. He stopped. "It's exactly what I've always said I don't do." The diner noise moved around them. Ethan let the silence sit because Richard wasn't finished, and rushing him would break something that was trying to be real. "I fired you," Richard continued, "and then I told myself every day for 6 weeks that I'd been right, that you were reckless, that the rules had to mean something." His voice dropped slightly. "And then I found out where you'd landed and why. And I couldn't. The story didn't fit anymore. The narrative I'd built." He looked at Ethan. "So instead of questioning the narrative, I tried to kill the evidence." There it was. Not dressed up, not hedged, just the flat truth of it said out loud in a diner booth by a man who had spent 6 weeks building walls around a mistake and had finally, at significant personal cost, stopped building. Ethan looked at him for the moment. "The calls you made," Ethan said, "to the Ryder Regional VP, to Garcia in Fort Collins." "I know." Richard didn't look away. "Those were wrong. I'm going to make calls to correct them. I've already drafted what I'm going to say." "What happened at Summit?" Ethan said. "The restructuring meeting." Richard's expression shifted. "I've been doing what I do when something isn't working. I started examining the systems, the procedures, the organizational structure." He paused. "It took me 3 weeks to admit that the systems weren't the problem. The people," Ethan said. "The people," Richard said, "or more accurately, the way I'd been treating the people." He set down the mug. "I have excellent mechanics, Ethan. I had excellent mechanics. Marcus Webb is one of the best technicians I've ever employed. And I looked at the floor last week and realized that I have been running a shop for 23 years on the principle that the business comes first, the rules come second, and the people exist to serve both of those things." He looked at Ethan with something exhausted in his eyes. "And that principle works. The numbers work. Summit has been profitable every year for 19 consecutive years." A pause. "But I walked that floor last week and realized I couldn't name what 3 of my longest tenured employees cared about outside of work. I couldn't tell you what motivated them, what frustrated them, what they were good at that I wasn't using." "Because you never asked," Ethan said. "Because I never asked." The words landed in the space between them, and neither man reached to move them. Ethan looked at Richard Cole, this man who had cost him a job and 47 days of uncertainty and the professional anxiety of being defined by a framing he hadn't consented to, and tried to find anger that was worth spending. He couldn't locate it. What he found instead was something more complicated, the recognition of a man who had reached the edge of his own story and was standing there without a map. Ethan had seen it before in customers who'd been told their vehicle was beyond saving, in people who'd built their certainty around a diagnosis that turned out to be wrong. The particular devastation of discovering that the framework you've been using to navigate everything is inadequate. It didn't make what Richard had done acceptable, but it made it human. "What do you want from this meeting?" Ethan asked. Richard was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure I want anything. I think I needed to say it to your face. I made the calls. I told myself they were professional, and then I went home and couldn't sleep. And after 4 nights of not sleeping, I understood that the only way through it was to say it directly. To me. To you." Ethan picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "I'm not going to tell you that you were right to fire me," he said. "You weren't. You made a decision based on a vest and then built a legal framework around it. And then when the consequence of that decision became inconvenient to your self-image, you tried to damage my career." He looked at Richard directly. "Those are real things that happened." Richard held eye contact. "Yes. But," Ethan continued, "I also think you know that. And I think the fact that you're sitting here saying it out loud without a lawyer, without any strategic angle I can identify, I think that means something." Richard looked at him carefully. "What does it mean?" "It means you're capable of looking at yourself clearly when you're willing to." Ethan paused. "The question is what you do with it." "What would you do?" Richard asked. And it was genuine, not rhetorical, not defensive. The question of a man who had run out of his own answers and was asking someone else's. Ethan thought about Thomas Reed, 25 years of excellence sidelined by a manager who didn't like questions. He thought about Olivia Carter running diagnostic sequences faster than the protocol, because she'd been forced to solve problems alone so long that working alone was the only mode she knew. He thought about Darius presenting his electrical fault methodology to 4 other technicians on Thursday morning with the controlled energy of someone who'd been waiting to be heard. He thought about his father's shop, 30 years, a reputation that meant something. "Go back to Summit," Ethan said. "Not to restructure, not to review the systems. Go back and talk to your people. Actually talk to them, ask Marcus what he thinks is wrong, and then listen to the whole answer without interrupting to explain why the current system makes sense." He looked at Richard. "Ask the question I should have heard you ask a long time ago. What are you capable of that I'm not using?" Richard was very still. "And when they tell you," Ethan continued, "believe them. Don't filter it through what's operationally convenient. Just believe it and figure out how to use it." A long silence. "That's it," Richard said. "That's everything," Ethan said. "It sounds simple because it is simple. The hard part is that simple things require you to let go of complicated defenses." He paused. "And you've been defending yourself for 23 years. That doesn't just come off." Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something that Ethan had not predicted. He said, "Would you be willing to consult for Summit? Paid, obviously, a real engagement." He held up a hand before Ethan could respond. "Not because I can't figure this out myself, but because you walked into a broken operation at Ryder, and in 2 weeks I'm hearing things have shifted significantly. Whatever you're doing, I'd like to understand it better." A pause. "And because asking you feels like the right kind of accountability for what I did." Ethan stared at him. "You're asking the man you fired to help fix your shop. I'm asking the best diagnostic mechanic I ever employed," Richard said. "And I'm asking him in his professional capacity. Because I was wrong about the diagnosis of what's wrong with Summit, and I think you'd be able to see it faster and more clearly than I would." He held Ethan's gaze. "You can say no. I wouldn't blame you." Ethan looked at the man across from him. He thought about what it cost a 51-year-old self-made businessman, a man who had built his identity on being right, to sit in a diner booth and ask this particular question of this particular person. He thought about what his father would have said. He thought his father would have said, "You do good work because you do good work." "I'll think about it," Ethan said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, and Richard Cole heard the difference and nodded once, accepting it. They talked for another 40 minutes, and it was different from the first part, less excavation, more practical. Richard described what he was seeing at Summit with the clear-eyed specificity of a businessman who was genuinely good at reading operations once his ego was out of the way. He talked about Marcus, about the team, about 3 technicians he'd promoted based on seniority, who were mediocre in their roles while more talented people beneath them had stopped trying. He talked about a customer satisfaction issue he'd been addressing with process changes when the real problem he now suspected was that customers didn't trust the shop the way they used to, not because of the process, but because the people inside it had stopped being engaged. Ethan listened. He asked 3 questions. Richard's answers to all 3 were perceptive and honest and indicated that when he wasn't defending himself, he saw his operation with considerable clarity. When they finally stood to leave, Richard put out his hand. Ethan shook it, not as forgiveness, not as absolution, but as the acknowledgement of 2 people who had looked at each other without armor and found something workable in what they saw. He drove back to Ryder Automotive thinking. I was in the parking structure, engine off, keys in his hand, before he realized what he was actually thinking about. He was thinking about how the same week he'd been given a position by Daniel Ryder. Because of what he'd done in the rain, Richard Cole had shown up trying to dismantle it. And now, 10 days later, Richard Cole was sitting in a diner asking for his help. Both things had come from the same decision. One night, one seized caliper. One father trying to get to his daughter. He sat in the parking structure for a while with that. Then he went up to the floor. The Thursday training session had been the turning point, though he hadn't known it was the turning point while it was happening. Darius had stood in front of 12 technicians at 6:45 in the morning and walked them through electrical fault diagnosis with the precision and confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment without knowing he was preparing for it. 3 of the senior techs had started asking questions, 20 minutes in genuine questions, competitive in the best sense, the kind of intellectual back and forth that happened when capable people were given a space where being capable was the point. Phil had stood at the edge of the group and watched with the expression of a man seeing something he'd been told was possible, but hadn't believed until now. Afterward, Thomas Reed had said to Ethan quietly, "That kid is extraordinary." "I know," Ethan said. "How long has he been here?" 8 months. Thomas was quiet for a moment. 8 months of oil changes. Not anymore. Thomas looked at him. "You know, when you first walked in here, I thought you were going to be another person who'd come in, rearrange the furniture, and leave." He paused. "I've had 3 of those." "What do you think now?" Ethan asked. Thomas considered. "I think you're someone who sees the actual problem. A beat. That's rarer than it should be." It was the closest Thomas Reed had come to a compliment in what Ethan suspected was a significant stretch of time. He received it in the spirit it was given, straightforwardly, without making too much of it. The floor by the end of week 3 was measurably different from the floor he'd walked into. Not transformation took longer, required more, demanded a kind of sustained trust that grew in months, not weeks. But different in the ways that mattered. The conversations were different. The pace was different. The particular quality of a space where people were actually invested in the work rather than performing investment that was different. Customer satisfaction scores from the first 2 weeks of Ethan's tenure had come back on Friday morning, and Daniel had texted him a single message. Up 11 points. Keep going. But the thing that mattered most to Ethan, more than the scores, more than the Callahan contract running ahead of schedule, more than Phil's increasingly confident floor management, happened on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week. And it had nothing to do with diagnostics or scheduling or any of the technical architecture of what he'd been building. It happened because of a customer named Ray Kowalski. Ray Kowalski was 68 years old and had been bringing his vehicles to the Ryder Denver Service Center since it opened, which was 14 years ago. He'd spoken to Ethan briefly in the 2nd week, a quick introduction at the service counter, nothing significant. But on this Wednesday, he came back not for service, just walked in and asked at the front desk if Ethan Walker was available. Ethan came out to the lobby. Ray was a solid man, retired construction, with hands that told the whole story in the direct manner of someone who said what he meant because he'd reached an age where anything else seemed like a waste of time. "I wanted to tell you something," Ray said. "I've been coming here 14 years, and I've been thinking about switching shops for the last 2. He paused. "I came in last week to get my wife's car serviced, and I talked to a young guy named Darius for about 20 minutes. About what he'd found and why not just what it was going to cost him." He looked at Ethan steadily. He knew his stuff, but more than that, he actually took the time to make sure I understood it. He drew a diagram on a piece of paper. "For me." Another pause. "Nobody's done that here in a long time." Ethan waited. I'm not switching shops, Ray said. I just wanted whoever was responsible for that to know that it mattered. He shook Ethan's hand and left. Ethan stood in the lobby for a moment after he was gone. I thought about Patricia Huang, whom Daniel Ryder had mentioned in his office, the customer at Summit who'd said Ethan had spent 90 minutes explaining a repair because she didn't trust the industry anymore. He thought about the thread connecting that conversation to this one, the invisible line between a mechanic who listened to a customer and a 24-year-old technician who drew a diagram on a piece of paper so a 68-year-old man could understand what was happening to his wife's car. You couldn't train that, but you could create the conditions where it could happen. That was what he'd been building. He went back to the floor and found Darius at his terminal and told him what Ray Kowalski had said. Darius went very still. He came back just to say that. A pause. Something moved through Darius's face that was young and real and completely unguarded for about 3 seconds before he got it under control. Okay, Darius said quietly. Okay. He turned back to his terminal. His posture was different, straighter, not with pride exactly, with something deeper. The physical language of a person who has been told that the thing they believed mattered actually does. Ethan left him to it. He was walking back to his own station when his phone rang. He checked the screen and felt his chest tighten once quickly. It was Jackson Ryder. He answered it. Jackson. Ethan. The voice was the same as he remembered, deep-weathered, but with something warmer in it now than the desperate, stripped-down quality of a parking lot in a rainstorm. You got a few minutes? Sure. I heard from Daniel that things are going well at the Denver location. A pause. I also heard Richard Cole came to see you. Tuesday, Ethan said. Daniel told me what he did, the calls he made, the regional VP. Jackson's voice had a careful quality like a man keeping something on a leash. I want you to know if you want me to handle that, I will. Handle it how? A pause that managed to communicate quite a lot without words. Jackson. Ethan's voice was even. I appreciate that, but it's handled. Richard and I talked, and it's handled. You sure? I'm sure. A silence. Then Jackson said, You know why I'm calling. Tell me. Lily wants to meet you. The change in his voice on her name was exactly what it had been in the garage, that particular softness. She knows the story. I told her what you did. She's been asking about the mechanic who fixed my bike. A pause. She wants to bring you a drawing. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, something quiet and specific. A horse, he said. Jackson made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else. What else? Tell her I'd be honored, Ethan said. Saturday I can bring her to Denver. Saturday's good. Ethan. A pause. I know Daniel has thanked you. I know this turned into something I don't know, bigger than any of us expected. But I want to say it to you directly, man to man. His voice dropped to the register of something sincere and unperformed. What you did that night, it wasn't just the bike. It was the fact that you saw me. Not the vest, not the reputation. Me. Another pause. I've had people look past me my whole life, or through me. You're the first stranger in 20 years who saw me for exactly what I was in that moment. Ethan sat down on the edge of a bay stool. The floor noise continued around him, the healthy, alive noise of people working at their actual level, and he listened to it for a moment while he thought about what to say. You were a father trying to get to his daughter, Ethan said finally. That's the easiest thing in the world to see if you're paying attention. Most people aren't paying attention. I know. A pause. I know. A silence on the line that was comfortable in the way silences are between people who have said the important things and don't need to fill the remaining space. Saturday, Jackson said. Saturday, Ethan confirmed. He hung up and sat for a moment. I thought about Lily drawing horses on every piece of paper in a house he'd never seen. He thought about a 7-year-old girl with a temperature of 104, alone in a hospital, asking where her father was. He thought about a massive man in a Hells Angels vest, standing in a parking lot in the rain with his Harley dead beneath him, and fear in his eyes, the fear that doesn't have anything to do with reputation or appearance or history, the fear of running out of time. I thought about what it meant that a 38-minute repair in a closed garage had eventually reached into this floor. These people, Thomas Reed and Olivia Carter, and Darius and Phil and Ray Kowalski's wife's car, and Richard Cole sitting in a diner booth saying I couldn't sleep. He thought every thread leads somewhere. You just can't see where from the moment you pull it. He stood up. He went back to work. And then at 20 minutes to 5, everything shifted again. Because Daniel Ryder walked onto the floor. Not unusual in itself, Daniel visited the Denver location regularly. But the way he walked in told Ethan something immediately. There was a quality of urgency under his composed surface, the kind that Daniel had learned to compress, but that Ethan had spent enough time reading people to recognize. He crossed to Ethan directly. "I need 5 minutes," he said quietly. They walked to the edge of the floor, away from the active bays. "I had a call this morning," Daniel said, "from our board's oversight committee. They've been reviewing the performance turnaround at this location." He paused. "They want to formalize your role." Ethan looked at him. "Formalize how?" "Director of Service Operations, across all 37 locations." Daniel's voice was measured, but there was something in his eyes that was watching Ethan closely. The committee reviewed the Week 3 numbers from Denver, the satisfaction scores, the Callahan contract timeline, the turnover projections for this quarter. They cross-referenced it against what you've put in place here. A pause. "Ethan, in 3 weeks, you've moved a struggling location satisfaction scores 11 points, and you've done it without firing a single person. You just reorganized who was doing what." "Reorganized who was being seen," Ethan corrected quietly. "Yes," Daniel nodded, "and the board wants that applied systematically across the group." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a lead diagnostic job," he said. "No, it isn't. I'd be leaving the floor." "You'd be on every floor," Daniel said. 37 of them. Ethan turned this over. He thought about Thomas Reed and Olivia Carter and Darius and the specific irreplaceable work of walking into a broken place and actually looking at what was there. He thought about doing that 37 times, or helping other people do it, which was a different thing and a harder thing, and possibly a more important thing. He thought about the condition he'd set in Daniel's office on that first day. The floor workers get a voice, an actual conversation where what they say matters. 37 floors, 37 rooms full of Thomas Reeds and Olivia Carters and Darius's who'd been doing oil changes when they were capable of so much more. "I have conditions," Ethan said. Daniel almost smiled. "I expected you would. Phil Garrett gets a real promotion, service manager title with the authority to match. He's earned it. I want that done before I take any expanded role." "Done." Thomas Reed gets a senior diagnostic title and a pay grade that reflects what he's actually been doing for 25 years. Retroactive to this month. Done. Olivia Carter gets cross-trained on every system we have. I want her ready for a team lead role within 6 months. Done. And Darius, Ethan paused. Darius gets to run the electrical training program company-wide, not as a pilot, as a permanent program. Daniel looked at him for a moment. He's 24, and he's the best electrical diagnostician in this building, possibly in this organization. Age isn't experience. Ethan looked at him steadily. You told me you can't train someone to see people clearly. You're right, but you can put someone in the right room to be seen. That's what this is. Daniel studied him. You're building a pipeline. I'm recognizing what's already there, Ethan said. That's different. A silence. Then Daniel said, all 4 conditions are accepted, effective immediately. He looked at Ethan with the same expression he'd worn in his office on the first day, the look of a man confirming something he'd been hoping to confirm. You realize this is not the job you applied for. I didn't apply for anything, Ethan said. You called me. Fair point. Daniel put out his hand. Director of Service Operations. Ethan looked at the hand. He thought about Cedar Ridge, about a parking lot in a rainstorm, about a father running out of time. He thought this is where that night leads. He shook Daniel's hand. Across the floor, Thomas Reed was walking Olivia Carter through the final phase of the Callahan engine evaluation. Their voices low and technical and alive with the particular energy of 2 people who had finally found each other's level. Darius was at his terminal, already preparing materials for next Thursday's session. Phil was at the service desk talking to a customer, and from where Ethan stood, he could see Phil's posture, straight attentive, the posture of a man who believed he could help. Ethan looked at all of it. He thought one decision, one wet night, one father and his daughter in 38 minutes in a closed garage. He thought, look where the thread goes. He didn't know yet that the thread had one more place to go. Saturday arrived the way important days sometimes do, quietly without announcing itself, just another morning that turned out to hold everything. Ethan was at the Denver Service Center by 7, even though the location was closed on weekends, and Jackson wasn't bringing Lily until 11. He didn't have a particular reason to be there that early. He told himself he needed to review the Callahan contract final sign-off documentation. That was true, but it wasn't the reason. The reason was that the floor had become, in the space of 3 weeks, somewhere he wanted to be, not because of the title or the trajectory or any of the external things that had shifted so dramatically in such a short time, but because of the specific feeling of a place that was working the way it was supposed to work. He needed to be around that for a while before the day got complicated. He sat at a workbench in the quiet of the empty floor and went through the Callahan paperwork, and the silence around him was the good kind. The silence of a space that was resting rather than a space that was defeated. He could tell the difference now. He'd been in enough of both. He thought about the week. The promotion had been announced internally on Thursday. Daniel had sent the company-wide communication himself, which Ethan understood was a signal, not just that the role mattered, but that Daniel wanted the organization to understand the reasoning behind it. The communication hadn't been corporate in tone. It had been specific. It had named the Denver Service Center's 3-week performance shift. It had described in plain language what Ethan had done and how it had said, in a way that surprised Ethan with its directness for a corporate document. Sometimes the right person for a leadership role, not the person who seeks it, but the person who is already doing the work while nobody is watching. He'd read it twice and put his phone down and gone back to what he was doing. The responses from around the organization had started coming in Friday morning. Emails mostly from service managers at other locations. Some curious, some cautiously optimistic. A few that had the tone of people who had been waiting a long time for someone to come look at their floor and actually see it. One from a service manager in Colorado Springs named Barbara, who had 11 years in the role and who wrote, "I have 4 technicians who could be running this location if anyone had ever given them the room. I hope that's the kind of thing you mean when you talk about what you're building, because I have been trying to say that for 4 years." He'd written back immediately, "It is exactly what I mean. I'll be in Colorado Springs in 2 weeks." Thomas Reed had pulled him aside on Thursday afternoon after the announcement and said simply, "Good." One word. Thomas Reed did not waste words. Olivia Carter had said more than that. She'd found him at the end of the day when most of the floor had cleared out and stood in front of him with the controlled precision she brought to everything and said, "Can I tell you something? Please. When I started here 14 months ago, I had a plan. I was going to work hard, demonstrate what I could do, and move into advanced diagnostic work within 6 months." She paused. By month 3, I understood that wasn't how this location worked. By month 6, I had stopped believing the plan was possible. Another pause. By month 12, I had started looking at other shops. She looked at him steadily. "I didn't leave because I couldn't afford to start over somewhere new. That's the honest truth." Ethan listened without interrupting. "And then you walked in," she said. "And in the second week, you put me with Thomas on the Callahan contract. And I worked 18 hours on that first evaluation and drove home at midnight and sat in my car in my parking lot and cried." She said it without apology, without softening it. "Not because I was sorry, because it had been so long since I'd been given work that matched what I was capable of that I'd forgotten what it felt like." Ethan held her gaze. "I want you to know that," she said. "Not because you need to know it, but because I think the people who change things should know when they've changed something." He didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about how to receive that, not deflecting it, not making it smaller than it was, not inflating it either. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." She nodded once precisely and went to get her things. He'd sat with that for a long time afterward. Now it was Saturday morning, and he was sitting in a quiet floor with Callahan paperwork and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he was thinking about Lily. He'd never met her. He knew her only through Jackson's voice on the phone, the particular softness that appeared in a rough man's speech when he said his daughter's name. He knew her through the detail of the horse's every piece of paper in my house, and through the image he'd built in his head of a 7-year-old girl with a fever of 104 in a hospital bed asking where her father was. She was healthy now. She'd been home for weeks. She was drawing horses. And apparently, she wanted to meet the mechanic who'd fixed her dad's bike. He finished the Callahan paperwork at 9:15, made fresh coffee, and spent 45 minutes doing something he rarely allowed himself, sitting with nothing to do and letting himself actually feel the weight of the past 6 weeks. Not analyzing it, not narrating it, just feeling it. The weight of 47 days without work. The specific humiliation of knowing that a version of his reputation was circulating in his industry that wasn't accurate and that he couldn't directly correct. The Tuesday morning certainty around week 5 of unemployment that he had been wrong, not about the decision but about the world. That the world didn't actually reward the right thing. That his father's philosophy was beautiful and functionally bankrupt. He'd been wrong about being wrong. That realization carried its own specific weight. I thought about all the people who had been right to do the right thing and hadn't gotten the call back. All the Olivia Carters who had left before someone came to look. All the Thomas Reeds who had eventually stopped asking questions, not because they'd found answers, but because the questions had cost too much for too long. The version of this story where Jackson's brother wasn't Daniel Ryder, where the rainstorm was just a rainstorm and the seized caliper was just a caliper and the closed garage was just a closed garage. I didn't let himself stay there long, but he let himself look at it because you should look at true things even when they're uncomfortable. The world didn't always reward the right thing on the timeline you needed, but sometimes it did. And when it did, you had an obligation to build something with it that was worth the cost of the times it didn't. That was what he was doing. He heard the front door at 11:02. Jackson came in first, which made sense given his size and the instinctive way he'd been navigating spaces that might be uncertain since the conversation in the garage. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a black jacket, no vest, which Ethan noticed and understood as a deliberate choice without making anything of it. And then behind him holding his hand was Lily. She was small with Jackson's dark hair and apparently her mother's eyes, which were lighter than Jackson's, and currently very wide and moving across the empty service floor with the thorough attention of a child who finds everything interesting. She was wearing a red coat and boots with horses printed on them, which Ethan saw immediately and which told him that Lily Ryder's commitment to her chosen subject was total and not limited to drawing. She spotted Ethan standing by the workbench, and she didn't look away the way some children do when they meet adults they've been told about. She looked directly at him with those wide, light eyes and held his gaze with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that looking directly at people was supposed to be complicated. Jackson said, "Ethan." Jackson. They shook hands, the same handshake as the garage, but different in the way that the same gesture carries different weight in different contexts. In the garage, it had been a man with nowhere else to go, thanking the only person who'd helped him. Now it was something more symmetrical. Two people who had ended up through a rainstorm and a seized caliper and a long chain of consequences, genuinely glad to know each other. Lily tugged Jackson's hand. "Dad," she said, the impatience of a 7-year-old who has been patient long enough. Jackson looked down at her. "Go ahead." She crossed to Ethan with the direct purposefulness of someone who had things to accomplish. She stopped in front of him, reached into the pocket of her red coat, and produced a folded piece of paper with the careful handling of something important. She held it out. He crouched down to her level and took it, unfolded it. It was a horse, drawn in pencil colored with what looked like colored pencils, a brown horse in mid-stride mane flying, and in the background barely suggested a motorcycle. Beneath the horse, in the careful, large letters of a child who had recently conquered, handwriting, it said, "Thank you for helping my dad." Ethan looked at it for a long moment. He looked at Lily, who was watching him with those wide, direct eyes, waiting to see if he understood that this was a serious gift given in full seriousness. "This is the best drawing I've ever been given," he said. He meant it completely. She considered this. "I can draw better ones," she said. "I was nervous." "You were nervous drawing it." She nodded with gravity. "Dad said you were important." "Your dad is very kind." Ethan looked at the drawing again. "But this one is my favorite because you drew it when you were nervous and you did it anyway." That's the hardest kind of drawing to make. Something crossed her face, a thinking it over expression that was serious and young and completely her own. Then she nodded once accepting this. "Okay," she said. She looked around the floor with renewed curiosity. "Is this where you fix cars?" "This is where I work, yeah." "Can I see the tools?" Jackson said. "Lily." "She can see the tools," Ethan said. He stood up. "Come on." He spent 20 minutes showing Lily Ryder around the service floor of a closed automotive shop on a Saturday morning, and it was one of the more purely enjoyable 20 minutes he'd had in recent memory. She asked questions with the relentless precision of someone who actually wanted the answers. What does that do? Why is that color? How heavy is that? What happens if you use the wrong one? And he answered all of them directly in her actual language without talking down to her. She was 7 and she was entirely serious, and she deserved serious answers. Jackson followed at a slight distance, watching his daughter interrogate a mechanic about torque specifications. And his face had an expression that Ethan caught twice the face of a man watching his kid be exactly herself in front of someone who was letting her and feeling everything that comes with that. At one point, Lily picked up a small wrench from a tool display, not from an active station, from a mounted display. Ethan had put up to help explain tool functions to customers and held it with both hands, turning it over. "It's heavier than it looks," she said. "Most things worth using are," Ethan said. She thought about that, gave him back the wrench. "Dad says you didn't ask for money when you fixed his bike." "That's right. Why not?" The directness of it, the pure, undiluted 7-year-old, why not landed without warning, and Ethan found himself thinking about it genuinely, the way you think about questions that deserve real answers rather than convenient ones. "Because of what your dad needed wasn't something I could put a price on," he said finally. "He needed to get to you. There's no number for that." She absorbed this very seriously. Then Dad cried when he got to the hospital. Jackson said, "Lily." "He did," she said, undefensive. She looked at Ethan. "He doesn't usually cry. He said he cried because he was scared he'd miss me." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "I could see that he was scared. That's why I opened the garage." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she gave a small, decisive nod, the nod of someone who has asked the question they needed to ask and gotten an answer they can trust. "Good," she said, and went back to examining the tool display. Jackson caught Ethan's eye over her head. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They stayed for another 30 minutes, and at some point it stopped being a formal visit and became something more ordinary and more real. The three of them at the workbench. Lily drawing horses on a piece of paper Ethan found for her. Jackson and Ethan talking in the easy lateral way of people who have already covered the important things and can now talk around them. Jackson asked about the new role. Ethan described it without inflation. Jackson said, 37 locations, and shook his head slowly. Ethan said, "I'm not there yet." Jackson said, "You will be." They talked about Thomas Reed, about Darius, about Phil's first team meeting and the 5 things that came out of it that nobody had said in months. Jackson listened with genuine interest, not the polite interest of someone enduring a subject they don't care about, but the real attention of someone who recognized in these stories something that mattered to him. "You know what you're actually doing," Jackson said at one point, "is what good chapter leaders do. You walk in, you figure out who's actually capable and who's been overlooked, and you build a structure around the real talent instead of the surface talent." Ethan looked at him. "You run your chapter." Jackson met his eyes. "For 11 years. Ethan thought about that. "What's the hardest part?" Jackson didn't hesitate. "Getting people to believe their contribution matters after they've been told for long enough that it doesn't." He paused. "People stop offering their best when their best keeps getting wasted. Getting them to try again, that's the hardest thing." "That's exactly it," Ethan said. "That's exactly what I'm dealing with across the organization." Jackson nodded. "What do you do about it?" "You show them," Ethan said, "not tell them. You put them in the room with the real problem and let them solve it. And when they do, you make sure everyone knows." Darius in the training program. Darius in the training program. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "I underestimated you when I first saw you," he said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "In the garage. In the garage, I thought you were a kid being naive, helping a stranger because you didn't know better." He paused. "I was wrong about that." "You were in a parking lot in the rain terrified about your daughter," Ethan said. "You can underestimate people under those circumstances." "Still wrong." Jackson looked at him directly. "You knew exactly what you were doing, and you did it anyway. That's different from naive." Lily looked up from her drawing. "Can I take this home?" Ethan looked at the drawing. She'd made another horse, this one better than the one she'd brought, the nervous one. This one was confident, fluid. "You made it," he said. "It's yours." "I'm going to make you another one," she said. "A better one when I'm not nervous anymore." "I'll keep both," Ethan said. "The nervous one and the brave one. Both of them are real." She thought about this and appeared to find it satisfactory. They left at 12:30. Jackson shook his hand again at the door. Lily, who had apparently decided during the course of the morning That Ethan was someone she could hug, wrapped her arms briefly around his waist with the unself-conscious completeness of childhood, and then stepped back and took her father's hand. He watched them go. He stood in the doorway of the service center for a moment after their car had turned out of the lot holding Lily's horse, drawing the nervous one, the one she'd made before she knew if he was worth the effort, and he thought about the thread. He thought this is where it went. He went inside. He'd had a call at 2 p.m. that he hadn't told anyone about yet. He'd scheduled it Thursday night after the promotion announcement, after Olivia's conversation in the empty floor. He'd made the call himself, looked up the number himself, because there were things that needed doing that nobody else was positioned to do. The call was to Marcus Webb, not to catch up. Marcus knew the situation they'd been talking through the whole 6 weeks. The call was to offer him something. Marcus answered on the second ring with his documentary narrator voice and the comfortable ease of someone who always picked up when Ethan called. "I have a question," Ethan said without preamble, "and I need you to actually think about it before you answer." "Okay." Wary now, alert. The Denver location service manager position was Phil Garrett. Phil is being promoted to a regional role. The location needs a new service manager. Ethan paused. "I want it to be you." Silence. "Marcus, I heard you, I'm thinking." A pause that stretched long enough to contain actual thought. "You're offering me the service manager position at the Ryder Denver location. Effective in 30 days, which gives you time to give proper notice at Summit and gives me time to get the paperwork finalized." Ethan paused. "The salary is considerably better than Summit. The team is good, it's getting better. You'd be stepping into something that's already moving in the right direction." "Why me?" Marcus said, not fishing, genuinely asking. "Because you're the best I know," Ethan said, "and because you told me once that you'd run your own operation someday. This isn't your own operation, but it's close." And because he stopped. Because the right thing and the smart thing turn out to be the same thing more often than people expect. "I owe you the chance to see that for yourself." A long silence. "Can I call you back in an hour?" Marcus said. "Take 2. Marcus called back in 45 minutes. "Yes," he said. No preamble, no conditions, no qualifications, just yes. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. "Good," he said. "I'll send the paperwork Monday." He hung up. He sat with that for a while, the particular satisfaction of a circle completing a thread reaching its natural end. Marcus at Summit watching Ethan carry boxes across the floor. Marcus in Denver building the thing they'd both been trying to name for years. "I thought Richard doesn't know yet." He thought that's Richard's problem to handle, and he's capable of handling it. And then because the day had apparently decided it wasn't finished with him, his phone rang again. A number he didn't recognize. Area code he didn't place. He answered. "Mr. Walker," a woman's voice professional but with warmth underneath it. "This is Sarah Okafor. I'm with the Colorado Automotive Industry Association. We're putting together our annual conference programming for next spring, and we've been hearing your name from several quarters over the past 2 weeks." A pause. "We'd like to ask you to speak about workforce development and talent recognition in service operations." Ethan looked at the horse drawing on the workbench in front of him. The nervous one. Lily's first attempt made when she wasn't sure if the effort would be worth it. I thought about what he'd say. He thought about Thomas Reed in 25 years. He thought about Olivia Carter crying in a parking lot at midnight because someone had finally given her the right problem to solve. He thought about Darius drawing a diagram on a piece of paper so an old man could understand what was happening to his wife's car. He thought about what his father had said and what it actually meant when you built a life around it. "Yes," he said, "I'll speak." He thanked her. He got the details. He hung up. He sat in the quiet of the Saturday service center for a few more minutes doing nothing, which was something he was slowly getting better at. The horse drawing was in front of him. Thomas Reed's desk was visible from where he sat, already loaded with Callahan documentation and the particular organized chaos of a man who cared deeply about his work. Olivia's terminal was dark, but her chair was pulled slightly out the way she left it every evening, not pushed in, not abandoned, just paused. Darius's training materials for next Thursday were stacked neatly on the corner of his station. Phil's office had a plan in it now. He'd mentioned he was going to get one, and he had. Ethan looked at all of it. I thought about what Richard Cole had said in the diner, not the confession, not the apology, but the thing he'd said near the end, when they were getting up to leave, almost as an afterthought. Richard had looked at him and said, I keep asking myself what I'd have done differently. If I'd watched that footage and seen a father instead of a vest. He'd paused. I don't know that I would have done anything differently. I think I would have made the same call. Another pause. That's the thing I can't resolve. Ethan had thought about that since. He'd thought about it Thursday and Friday, and this morning before Jackson and Lily arrived. He knew the answer now sitting in the quiet of a place he'd helped become something worth being in. The answer was that Richard could not have done differently. Not then, not with the understanding he had at that moment. People don't act beyond their understanding. They act within it, and sometimes what's within it is limited, and sometimes the limitation costs someone else something real. What you could do, what Richard was doing slowly and painfully, and without guarantee of success, was expand the understanding. Ask the questions you'd been avoiding. Listen to the answers that made you uncomfortable. Sit in a diner booth with the man you'd wronged and say it out loud without a lawyer present. That didn't erase what had happened, but it was the only real direction available. 3 weeks after the diner meeting, Richard Cole did call. Not to negotiate, not to strategize. He called and said, I talked to Marcus this morning. He gave me proper notice and told me where he was going and why. A pause. I called to tell you I think you made the right call offering him the position. Another pause longer. I also called to say I took your advice. I sat down with my senior techs, all 5 of them, one at a time, asked what they were capable of that I wasn't using. What did they say? Ethan asked. Too much to repeat in one call, Richard said quietly. But I'll tell you that my best technician, a man named Carl, who's been with me for 16 years, told me he'd been trying to propose a fleet maintenance program for 3 years and never got past my assistant. A beat. I gave him 2 hours on Friday. He had the whole thing mapped out. Revenue projections, customer pipeline, staffing model. Richard's voice had something in it that Ethan recognized as the sound of a man recalibrating. He'd been carrying it for 3 years because nobody opened the door. What are you going to do? We're launching the program in 60 days, Richard said. Carl is running it. Ethan let that sit for a moment. Richard, he said, yeah, that's the right call. A pause. Then I know. And the way he said it, not with pride, not with the self-congratulation of someone reporting a good decision, but with the slightly worn quality of a man who understood what it meant that this was right and what it meant that it had taken so long. That was the sound of someone actually learning something. They didn't talk for long. There wasn't yet the kind of relationship that required long calls. But there was the beginning of something, not friendship exactly, but something in the same family. 2 people who had looked at each other honestly at significant cost to both and had found something on the other side of it that they hadn't expected. Ethan hung up and looked at Lily's drawing one more time. He thought about everything. I thought about a 32-year-old mechanic who couldn't go home because the apartment smelled wrong, standing at the window of a closed garage in Cedar Ridge, listening to an engine in trouble. He thought about the moment before he opened the door, that fraction of a second where the decision was still unmade, where he could have walked back to the break room and finished his cold coffee and gone home, and none of this would have happened. I thought about what kind of man he would have been if he'd made that other choice. He thought it wouldn't have been me. That was it, finally. That was the whole truth of it, the part that he hadn't been able to name clearly until now. Sitting alone on a Saturday in a place he'd helped build into something worth building. He hadn't opened that door because of his father's philosophy or because he was especially brave or because he'd done some rapid moral calculation and arrived at a conclusion. He'd opened it because he was someone who opened doors when engines were in trouble, and that was not a rule he followed. That was who he was. Richard had made the call he was capable of making. Ethan had made the call he was capable of making. And the difference between those 2 calls, the gulf between seeing a vest and seeing a father, that difference had led to all of this. Thomas Reed back at full capacity, Olivia Carter with work that matched what she was capable of, Darius teaching, Marcus coming, 37 floors waiting, Carl and his fleet program, Lily and her horses, all of it from one open door. All of it from one man who looked past the surface and saw the thing underneath. That was the story, not the promotions, not the title, not the building Ethan had walked into and would walk into 36 more times, carrying the same questions and the same willingness to hear the real answers. Those were the consequences. The story was smaller and more precise than any of those things. The story was a man in a rainstorm who needed to get to his daughter and a mechanic who saw that clearly and a door that opened. Everything else followed, because the truth is that character is not revealed in the moments you plan for it, is revealed in the moments you don't, in the gap between the choice that cost you nothing and the choice that cost you everything, in the 3 seconds before you open the door, when you could still turn around. Ethan Walker turned toward the door. That is who he was. That is what it built.